Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Existential Delight. My name is Dylan Goos. Today we kick off something new here on the channel, in which I invite people on and we have a conversation. To kick things off, the inaugural guest is Mr. Owen Cyclops. He's an incredible illustrator and a very interesting guy. We spoke for just over an hour about everything from New Age thought to Christianity. I've included links in the description to his website and his resources where you can find his art. And I really recommend you go and check it out. As we have the discussion, you'll see his art popping up on the screen throughout. I've included a lot of different pieces by him, and you'll also see a video of him actually illustrating as we have the discussion. Let me know what you think in the comments. Consider giving it a like, and if you're new here, consider subscribing if you'd like more content like this. And on that note, we turn now to the conversation with Owen Cyclops. Today I have a very special guest here on the show, and his name is Owen Cyclops. Hi, Owen.
Yes, happy to be here, man. How's it going?
Good. Can't complain. So glad that you could come on. I'm a big fan of your art, and I've been itching to have a conversation with you for a while now. So I'm really glad you could be here.
Perfect, man. Yeah, pleasure's all mine.
Awesome. So for any of the viewers who don't know, you are a very interesting artist, especially in terms of the way you use symbols to convey ideas in your art. Especially, I think it's really nice to see Christian symbols. Is that something that, were you always using Christian symbols in your art, or is it as a result of something that happened in your personal life?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I guess basically the widest possible view of kind of like the arc that I'm on is that I've always been an artist. I'm really like an illustrator, so I'm kind of like not doing fine art like oil painting, but I really am an illustrator. So I think that's part of like the symbolic quality of it, like conveying information and ideas through pictures is kind of what I do. But in terms of the Christian stuff, no, actually. And I think that's part of why maybe a lot of people find my art to be in like an interesting place in terms of like overlapping Venn diagrams. I guess the shortest answer would be that I used to be really into occult, esoterica, Eastern religious stuff, just kind of the general grab bag of like really weird spiritual things in general. And then, yeah, I became Christian later on. So then I kind of stepped into that whole world, and obviously it like radically altered my art and everything with it.
Wow, that's really interesting. Would you say that your experiences with the sort of more esoteric side of well, I guess you could say just knowledge, do you think that in some way that actually intensified your approach to Christianity when you eventually reached it?
Yeah, you could definitely say that. Well, really, the way I would phrase it is that, I don't know, it seems really unintuitive, I think, to some people, but there is an archetype that I would describe as like the reformed occultist. And it's not just a thing in Western culture. I mean, I used to be way more into Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. And even in Tibetan Buddhism, there's this figure named Milarepa. And he literally is someone who like studied to be like a full-on like dark wizard, like summoning like demons and storms and things like that. And eventually, by going along that path so far, he eventually becomes Buddhist. Tibet's a Buddhist society, obviously. So that archetype of someone, I feel like, who's poking around in like the darker kind of underbelly, or maybe they don't even realize it's the kind of darker underbelly, and then they eventually get led to an actual like theological system. That's definitely how I identify for sure. I mean, within the Western tradition, there's like Saint Cyprian. He was kind of like a dark magic-y sorcerer kind of guy. He became a saint. And even in more modern times, there's someone named Eliphas Levi. If anyone's seen like the classic Baphomet drawing, if you've ever seen an image of Baphomet, there's like one drawing and like he made it. But eventually near the end of his life, he came to the conclusion that all the like occult rituals and things that he was studying were kind of just cribbing off of the rituals and practices of the church, and he became Christian actually. So there's a lot of people like that, and I definitely see myself as part of that. I wouldn't really call it a tradition, but really it's an archetype. Yeah, so I'm definitely part of that archetype. And I guess you could say my conversion, if you wanted to call it that, which it was, I guess, was really, really
Yeah.
unexpected. But yeah, it's kind of like you're following these breadcrumbs and then it leads you to the most unexpected place. Like if you told me 5 years ago that I'd be making like Christian art, I definitely probably wouldn't have believed you.
Yeah, I can relate, man. And the first few pieces of Christian content I released, I was just I felt like I was coming out of the closet of like to all my subscribers, like at least in the religious sense, because um I'd released a lot of content about Alan Watts, and I had podcasts where I talked about his message, and I think I garnered a group of people that were following me, and I started thinking, well, I got to this point where I was like, I'm gonna have to do something for me, or I'm gonna have to do something to keep these people happy, and it eventually gets to a point where it's sort of non-negotiable, where it's just so much a part of you that you can't keep it separate from your art, because your art is ultimately an expression of, not to get too poetic, but the deepest recesses of your soul. So whatever's in those recesses is going to come out. And I think a lot of people just hear the word occult, or they hear the word even esoteric. And I think it's important to clarify that. And I mean, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but to me, occult just means hidden. It just means knowledge that isn't necessarily um, outright known. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody who writes something and calls it occult necessarily represents the whole tradition of what we consider occult. Um, but maybe you can relate to this. There was a time in my life where I was really desperately trying to create a system for myself to live. And I don't think I was aware that I was doing it at the time, but I would like, you experience these sort of internal problems or inconsistencies. Maybe it's problems with willpower or self-control or meaning or reason. And then I would desperately like try and find a system. Maybe it was alchemy, or maybe it was a certain branch of psychology, especially for a time I was really into Jungian psychology. And none of these systems really had I think Jonathan Peugeot calls it the metaphysical substructure to carry you. And then I can really relate to what you said about, if someone had told you 5 years ago you'd be a Christian, it just, you'd be making Christian art, sorry, you would never have believed them. It's the same for me. Like I never would have thought that I would find that substructure, that structure of being in Christianity. And then when I realized it was there, I realized that it's so much more depthful than anything I found in. I mean, I've got a book over there, The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. I don't
Yeah,
know
I
if you're
have it on
familiar.
my shelf also. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And I haven't read the whole thing because it's a beast. But like you read sections here and there, and I mean, I think I found more just attending one mass. I found more structure in the way I view life, the way I view death, the way I view meaning, the way I approach other people, the way I see other people, the way I see the world, the way I see nature. All of that was just in one mass, for me. And so there was this, finding Christianity was also this sort of realization that I'd been looking for something for so long, and now I've found it, but it's actually even more than I initially thought I even wanted. I don't know if you can relate to that at all.
No, definitely. Yeah, I can definitely relate to that totally. I mean, yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, I think that a big part of what I think draws people into, like, I guess you could say the occult, and yeah, like you said, like, what does that even really mean, like the occult? It's pretty poorly fleshed out, like our terminology for everything, but I
Mm,
kind of just see like a big grab bag of things that are kind of just hands-on or informational, not really systematized practices. Everything from like
mm,
what people would call like full-on like black magic to like kind of weird psychological esoterica to things that are more like new age to kind of like
mm,
Eastern ported over into the West practices. So yeah, it's not like I'm thinking of like one, concrete folder where everything's like cleanly squared off. But I think that what draws people into that worldview, in some way, at least like especially for people that are like my archetype, kind of like nerdy, overly analytical people, at least,
yeah.
um, is that it is like the fascination with, like you said, building your own system. It's kind of this
Mm,
you get to step in and say, okay, well, I'm going to cobble together, like you were saying, like, oh, like this parts of alchemy, and I'm going to like weld on like these pieces of like this psychological system. And then maybe one person in particular is into like Kabbalah, and here's how Kabbalah like stacks into that.
Yeah.
And I think that that kind of cobbling together has like a particular like ideological heritage. Like I kind of trace it back to like Aleister Crowley and stuff like that. But I
Mm.
think that that's part of like the fascination with it. But then also that's kind of why it bottoms out eventually. In
Mm.
sometimes painters make a joke where like for acrylic paint, if anyone doesn't know, acrylic paint just dries really fast. So the joke is, the great thing about acrylic paint is that it dries really fast, but the really bad thing about it is that it dries really fast. So I feel like it's kind of the same thing with the occult and, kind of cobbling together your own esoteric system because the good thing is that you get to put it all together yourself. But then the bad thing is that you're kind of just putting it all together yourself and it's like arbitrary in some way.
Mm.
So yeah, I think
Yeah.
that switch from like stacking up these blocks yourself and then you kind of pass over this line. Now you're like, oh, now I've stepped into this completely systematized, integrated, cohesive worldview. I think anyone
Mm.
that's experienced that definitely knows what that's like.
Yeah, it really feels like coming home, you know. That analogy has a lot of truth to it. Well, how do you view the occult and sort of esotericism in general now looking back at it from a sort of Christian worldview?
Well, it's interesting, man. I think it's a mix. I think it's a mix of things that are, well, I guess before I say that, I should kind of clarify that like part of the reason why I like talking about this is that, I never really imagined it would be the case, but I kind of feel like covertly it's kind of being pushed like so hard in just civilization in general. Like, I never really would have imagined that, but I kind of feel like once I kind of took my head up out of the books and was looking around, I kind of would see like shadows of these like titanic figures like cast and like people around me. And you
Mm.
open up Vice magazine and it's like you should do this like weird astrology stuff or like tarot stuff or like, whether or not that's good or bad, people can have their own opinion, but it's just kind of weird. You're just kind of like,
Mm.
why do I go to Urban Outfitters with my sister? She's buying a purse and there's a book about like how to be a witch on the table here. Like, whether or not you think
Mm.
that's good or bad, you kind of just have to ask yourself, like, why is that the case? So it's part of why I like
Yeah.
talking about it, just to clarify. But oh yeah, you asked me how I view it now. Well, I think it's a mix of things that are full on, like actually nefarious or corrupting, and that could be either because they're rooted in like a faulty premise that would be the main kind of thing there. So there's like a pocket of it that's kind of rooted in these like faulty premises, and that could be like lying to yourself about like the nature of reality or how the world works, or sort of like a misfounded or incorrect idea about like how the self relates to the universe or like what God is and things like that. And I think those
Mm.
can be kind of like corrupting. It's kind of like putting like bad fuel into your car. Like you might not notice for a while, but eventually it kind of will mess up the whole system. And then I
Yeah.
think it kind of fans out from there where there's some things where it's like kind of on the line, like maybe it's probably not evil, but it's like associated with bad things. So I don't really view it so black and white, but I think that there are a few like sort of like faulty grounds that people kind of start to build on. That's actually a better metaphor. It's like there's these big patches of
Mm.
sand, and if you start to build a building, you don't really notice you're building on sand until you're all the way up at the fifth floor and you're like, oh wait, like things aren't really level anymore. So a lot of things like that. I used to be really into like Aleister Crowley and you know things like that. I guess you could say that would be like the perfect example of kind of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love that analogy that you used of the sort of building of the grounds. I like to think of it almost like a blueprint. Like if you've got a faulty blueprint, even if you're sincerely trying to build, even if you're building like really, working hard, waking up early, if the blueprint's faulty, the building's going to come down at some point. So you might feel that you're really in how much time you invest. Um, Ultimately, if it's not grounded in anything fundamentally true, I think that that's going to come back at some point. You'd rather take a shack on a rock than a castle in the sand, right?
Yeah,
Um,
and the other thing, yeah, totally. It looks like the rock and sand metaphor, right?
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, the other thing I think that's interesting is that I've always been, even from like my very like youngest days of being, aware of anything at all, like really obsessed with like worldviews and how if you kind of take on a worldview or even just take on an idea, like people think it's kind of like drawing a card from a deck where you just take the card, but it's really not. Like every idea that you kind of integrate into your life is this huge spider web of implications. And I
Yeah.
feel like a lot of times people don't see those implications. And that was something else that I started picking up on when I was still in that world, but kind of leaving it. Like, you see people pick up these ideas, like, even just something like, something like, well, like I'm thinking of this guy I used to know actually who said, life, it doesn't have to really affect you. It's kind of like this pop, like maybe like cribbing like little bits of like Advaita Vedanta Hinduism into like Western like New Age, where it's like, your life is like something that you're watching on like a screen, and the screen
Mm.
has fire, but you don't get hot. The screen has ice, but you don't get cold. Like we choose how things affect us. And you see people
Mm.
around them being like, yeah, wow, that's so true. Like definitely. But then like, your cousin dies. And like, well, if you really
Oh man.
actually believed and internalized that, then you're just
Yeah.
gonna run headfirst into a brick wall with no seatbelt whatsoever. And I kept seeing that happen, like people kind of like putting themselves on these clouds, and then like when reality hits, it hits like really hard. And that was part of me realizing there was something up with like these worldviews and kind of like luring people in with like candy coated poison, I guess you could say, things like that.
Man, I can't really express to you how much that lays onto something I was telling someone earlier this week, where there was a time when just a few years back where my family was going through some real hard times, and my mom was like experiencing some like just some she was going through a really rough time, and we were walking in the garden, and she started crying, and I realized there's nothing. My system at the time, which was this sort of Advaita Vedanta mixed with sort of a kind of Wattsian approach plus. Okay, I'll jump back to that. But I was walking with her in the garden, and I just realized there's nothing I can say. This situation just falsified everything I thought I knew. There's nothing I can. It's like what's that expression that you test something by fire, iron by
Yeah.
fire, or and then if it in that fire, all those ideas and philosophies just completely melted away. And I have nothing against any particular person who practices Buddhism, but I can relate to Christ when I'm suffering because Christ suffered, and not only did he didn't, and it's not that Buddha didn't suffer, right? But Christ was betrayed. Christ was humiliated. Christ was the most innocent person tortured in the most horrific way. No one deserved. It's like the most heinous crime. And so, however low life is for me, I know that uh, literally, I mean, the God who I believe in went through that. You know,
Yeah.
so I didn't get that with anything else. He stands alone in that realm, and it's like you go, man, you, I don't want to jump to the next topic just yet, but you just look at that and you think, well, here's this philosophy that was developed maybe like 300 years ago. And then there's this guy who hit history so hard that he literally split it in two. It's like, well, man, it doesn't mean that he's God, but at least a little bit of reason to look into it, right?
Yeah, no, for
and
sure. Yeah, like the relationship of like how to experience suffering and like contextualize suffering was huge for me in terms of all this stuff, definitely. I mean, since I'm going to talk about it a little bit, I guess I should qualify like I usually don't really talk about Buddhism too much like on Twitter or anything, just because even when you say Buddhism, like just defining like, well, are you talking about Zen Buddhism or Tantric Buddhism
yeah,
or Theravada, so if
yeah,
anyone's listening and they're like, oh my God, I'm Buddhist, and it's not like that at all. Like I get it.
yeah,
I'm just kind of speaking like loosely and casually, and I'm also
yeah,
really speaking about like the pop. You're a Western person, you kind of get into it a little bit. That's kind of what I'm talking about.
yeah,
But yeah, I mean, it's really interesting actually, honestly, because when I was kind of in that world of like, I'm, a white guy doing psychedelics, really into the occult, and my kind of basis for this is like what I'm cobbling together out of Buddhism. I was kind of like that stereotype, like times a million. It was really interesting because honestly, I really was never sad about anything really ever. I was kind of happy like the whole time. And I
mm,
really think in retrospect, it's because it's like a really nice kind of narrative to put on things if you really strap on the helmet and like put on the glasses and you're like, Okay, well, actually, like all suffering in the universe, it's kind of like a glitch. It's kind of like a computer error. Like we're stuck in
Mm,
this samsaric world of cycles and stuff like that, and like your dog gets hit by a car, and it's just like kind of a glitch. It like shouldn't really have happened, but it happens because you're stuck in this weird cyclic world. But your dog's gonna get reborn and didn't really even exist to begin with, so like don't really worry about it. And if you meet someone on the street and they're like really an asshole to you, you can just be like, well, that person's really enlightened and they're just experiencing this momentary like obfuscation that's making them angry at me for no reason. So I really shouldn't get angry at them. And you can kind
mm,
of explain away everything like that for me and just you can just walk in this cloud of like, yeah, everything's great. And when it's not, it's kind of just an illusion, right? And like I said, yeah, I really wasn't sad ever for a really
yeah.
long time. And you were talking about the time with your mom, I really can relate to that because it sounds like a little psychopathic, but it's really not. It's more just like being like an awkward person. But yeah, I found that during that time, when people would talk to me about like sad things or bad things that happened to them, like I really cared and I really felt bad, but I kind of had this subconscious energy of like, yeah, that sucks. There's nothing we can do about it. So kind of like, why are you telling me? Like, I get why you're telling me. Like, I would never say that, but subconsciously, like you're
Mm,
saying, like your mom's crying there. And if you don't have it integrated in your worldview, how to like react to that, you're kind of just like, okay, like, yeah, that sucks. And I really like avoided sad things and sad topics and stuff like that. But now I have
mm,
like a totally different relationship to it. Like, I really understand like how suffering is integrated into life. And like when someone around me is suffering, I have like a totally different relationship to it. So yeah, I
yeah.
mean, I could go on about that, but I feel like that integration and like an accurate view of it was huge for me, definitely.
Yeah. Um, yeah, we could talk about just that one topic for like hours, but I wanna move on to something else now, which I think is
Cool.
also pretty interesting. And I've never actually spoken to anyone about this because I've just never had someone I could talk to about it. But there was a time when I was going to Psytrance festivals. um, I should add this beautiful Chesterton quote. He said, "Every living Christian was once a dead pagan," and right, I love it. And that was me. So I was attending these Psytrance festivals and very, very new age. I mean, I'm in South Africa and I could relate to what you were saying about being in a store with your sister and then seeing like a book on how to be a witch. It's like I mean, like maybe 10 years ago when I was growing up, there was like um, a lot of Christian stores, Christian merchandise in stores. We have these sort of generic home stores like, um, you can just go and buy like things for your house, like bookshelves and
hmm
plants and etc. I won't mention any names, but like when I was younger, there was like a lot of Christian imagery, and now, I mean, the other day there's just Buddhism everywhere, Buddha statues, Buddha paintings, Buddha everything, and it's not a niche store. I mean, it's like the general supplier, and so it's like there are these ideas do come into society. They do reflect what people are buying. And so the world around you changes based on the ideas people integrate into their lives, for better or for worse, right?
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
but anyway, so I'm at this Psytrance festival and a lot of New Age people. And one thing I noticed very keenly, and this is when I was in that world, and I was like, I was, listening to um, you kind of like just on Joe Rogan. I was on Joe Rogan every day. I'm listening to Alan Watts lectures at night. You know, weed is involved, psychedelics, and I'm attending Psytrance festivals. And I think, this is where it's at. This is what life is about. I don't think
Totally.
anything in life felt as like that was like the point of life, like attending the next festival because that's where you really got to just enjoy life. You didn't have to worry about anything. But I would like sit and talk to people. I remember sitting with this one guy and he seemed like I didn't know him, but a nice guy. We're sitting and we're talking, and then he says to me, we're having this really interesting conversation. At some point, he says to me, "You see those tables over there?" And I go, "Yeah." And he says, "If everybody just believed that tables floated, those tables would be floating." And so I sort of got hit out of this, like, wait, what? And I think he saw on my face. I was still trying to be polite, but I think he saw on my face that I couldn't follow him where he was going. And then you talk to the next person, and they have their own belief system that they've constructed, like you were saying earlier.
and it's completely different. There's similarities, but it's different to the next guy and the next guy and the next guy. And you realize that all anybody has in common here is that they smoke weed. And right, and there's no unity. And Terence McKenna actually ran into this problem constantly with his, I mean, even McKenna, just if he would give a lecture, at least, I mean, look, there's always going to be someone out there who considers themselves an expert in a topic, right? And there's going to be some guy maybe who's an expert in McKenna, who's read all of his books, and he might disagree with me. So again, I should, just a caveat, I'm speaking very, very casually, but like, it seems to me that he also ran into that problem of like, people are just, there's such a lack of structure. And so when I saw that, you can't talk to anybody about anything. You can't talk to them about suffering. You can't talk to them about, I remember once at a festival, somebody was like having a really bad time, and I don't even know where to begin to comfort her, because I don't know what anything is grounded in for this person. Like, what do they base their assumptions on? And the more I was in these situations, the more I realized how these, there's a lack of, there needs to be a certain level of structure. I mean, even for everybody to be here and to be at the party, we had to have structure in parking our cars. We had to have structure in buying tickets. So we have structure to allow us to get to the point where we can abandon structure. But you can't have a system where you've abandoned structure and think that you can still have structural lives within that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I
So
can definitely relate to that for sure. Yeah, I used to hang out in like a lot of like really hardcore like psychedelic circles and stuff like that, and I feel like that kind of is like something that kind of pops up every now and then, but no one really, like, since there's no one trying to do like the systemic theology of it, you don't really encounter it too much. But then like you're saying, yeah, you're talking to someone and they're like, all right, I'm gonna go outside and I actually just talk to this tree for like 45 minutes, and you're like, oh, word, like, huh? And you kind of want to unpack, like, so you're actually like, on that page, and like, is everyone else on that page? But yeah, I can definitely
mm,
relate to that for sure.
yeah, like, you have a longing to make things cohesive, but then just nothing comes together. And I think in some ways that is one of the biggest appeals of Christianity, is that, but it's not like, I think this is a misconception. People think it's like, oh, so you've just like, you don't have to think anymore. You just embrace this thing so that you don't have to think. It's like, not really. It's kind of like, I've been thinking about it for like forever. And it's led me to the point of realizing that I kind of, I found something that doesn't stop me from thinking, but actually gives structure to my thinking. Do you think that's a fair way to put it?
Totally. Yeah. Well, I definitely relate to the last part of what you said also, where it's like, I think that if I didn't like fully explain it to someone, then yeah, it would kind of sound like, well, I was like really confused and everyone was kind of saying all this different stuff. And then this guy came along and was like, well, here's this book that explains everything. And I was like, oh, wow, that must be true then. Perfect. Like this makes everything so simple. And I think that's kind of
Mm.
like the caricature of like converting to Christianity, honestly, is that that's basically how it's like caricaturized of like, oh yeah, well, if this guy says he has all the answers, then well, why not just believe him? And then we have all the answers. Like that's so great. But yeah, along with where we started about that like whole reformed occultist thing, like yeah, for me it was really like the most unlikely thing that I never saw coming ever, where I really just had reasoned myself to a conclusion that was like so close to Christianity that it actually really, really caught me totally off guard. And
Mm.
I actually really remember, it's probably interesting. I had this, it was like one particular moment where I had kind of like taken these steps where me like falling away from, all the worldview that we're kind of describing, it was basically like shutting doors, and I would take just like one step further out. Um, just to kind of go through it a little bit, I guess, is that with the Buddhist
Please.
stuff, what I finally found was like it wasn't really a break in terms of like the worldview, although I started to not really believe in reincarnation, but that's kind of like subjective. I didn't have like one philosophical reason for that. I just kind of didn't really think it was true anymore, which is not really like a philosophical defense. But I kind of felt like within the like pop Buddhism world or even the Buddhist philosophy stuff I was doing, I did go kind of hard into some Buddhist philosophy, just for the record. Not that I'm like an expert, obviously, but
Mm.
I kind of felt like it wasn't addressing like what became my two main questions, which were, why does evil exist? Like why are evil things like happening? And
Yeah.
then also, where did like the universe come from? And actually, in Buddhism, there's something called man, I forgot the Sanskrit name, but I would sound so smart if I remembered it. But there's something called the four imponderables. And supposedly there are these four things Buddha said that you just shouldn't think about because they're not going to help you get enlightened. And one of them is basically where the universe came from, because you're not going to figure it out, and it's not going to help you get enlightened. So it's kind of like off the table in Buddhism, in my opinion. And same
Yeah.
thing with evil. Like they talk about why bad things happen, but it's usually in terms of like, well, your past life, like your karma and this stuff. And so I kind of like started to, it was kind of like I stopped hanging out with Buddhism because it wasn't addressing like those questions. And then same thing with the occult stuff. So after that, I kind of turned to Western occult, and I was like, oh, well, I have my own backyard of like spiritual practices and, little weird underground things I can poke into. But then the same deal kind of happened where I was kind of like, I feel like I'm figuring out this stuff about good and evil, and like, is this stuff on like the good team? I'm kind of reading about like these demons and stuff, and these guys seem kind of weird. So I was floating for a while where I was like, man, I really don't know what to think about anything. I'm kind of skipping over a lot of steps just to keep it brief, but I
Yeah.
had this one moment where I was like sitting in my room and I was like, all right, so what I've reasoned out is like, well, I've reasoned out that God definitely exists for, two or three reasons that I guess we could go into. And I was like, but it's not this like apophatic, like totally vague, like fuzzy cloud God of like nothingness. Like God cares about stuff and like cares about humans to some extent. And I was like, but like God is so big and like all encompassing and like beyond human conception that if God did care about humans, then he would have to have some kind of like form that was made so that humans could like comprehend it. So there's like this big all-encompassing like making the universe God, but he also would have to have some like emanation that was like able to interact with like human life. And I guess if he cared about humans, he would have to like come to earth like to some extent. And then I had this moment where I was like, wow, like I'm actually describing Christianity. Like that's crazy. And I remember exactly where I was. I was in my room. My room was really dirty, obviously, because I still wasn't Christian yet. And I was like, wow, that's nuts. And it was like a huge pivot point for me, because I was like, wow. And there were a few other things too, coincidences that had been stacking up. And that was the moment where I was like, okay, I've been tabling all these coincidences, but now the pile of coincidences is so large that now it's like too much for me to just write it off. Sometimes the metaphor I use for people, if anyone's ever gone into, I really hate this term, but if anyone's ever looked into anything that is sometimes characterized as like a conspiracy theory or something, even just something simple like banks, having power in the world or something obvious, you never get like a piece of paper that says like, hey, banks have a lot of power. It's like you find all these clues, and eventually you have this pile of like 2,000 clues, and you're like, okay, I mean, I can't write this all off. That's kind of how it
Yeah.
was to me. Yeah.
Man, I can so relate. The analogy I tell people is there is no silver bullet. It's a gradual, like at least for me as well. It was like this indication here, this hint here, this experience there, this thing that happened there, this. And the more I studied history, the more you go back into it, the more there's like you say, thousands of clues that sort of all point in one general direction. And then the closer you get to that direction, the more you realize that they're oddly specific. And then you get to a point where it's like they're so specific that it's almost it starts taking more faith to not think that something's going on.
Yeah, that's
It's
exactly what it is. It becomes more of a leap to say, this pile of arrows all pointing to this point means nothing. It becomes more of a leap to like disregard it than to like accept that it obviously like means something.
exactly. And then one thing you mentioned that I really quickly want to touch on is what you said about karma and how, if you do something bad, it's like, karma will find its way. And karma was actually instrumental in me actually seeing Christianity as, again, not a silver bullet, but one of the many things. I realized that karma doesn't really explain things as well as grace, because there's this really great saying, let's hope that we get what we need. And it's I'm sort of paraphrasing. Let's hope that we get what we need, and maybe we'll get what we want. But let's pray that we never get what we deserve.
Yeah.
Because if we get what we deserve, boy, so you look around and you look at people and you think, if we were getting what we deserved, I mean, I just don't see that. Instead, I see people getting not what they deserve. I see grace everywhere,
Yeah,
everywhere.
totally. Yeah, yeah.
And it's like I suddenly realized like grace explains things so much better than karma. At least that was my experience with it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, totally. Well, yeah, with the karma and reincarnation thing, well, for a long time, I really did think that that was 100% real because
Mm.
it fit in with my whole worldview. Kind of like faux shamanism, psychedelics plus Buddhism. I was like, yeah, reincarnation, like this totally makes sense.
Yeah.
It's kind of a funny story actually, but when I ultimately really fell out of it, like I said, it's not really philosophical, but I was actually at this science museum and they had this like very realistic, almost like hologram, like diagram thing next to a video. And they were showing one of these, it's called like a rotifer. It's kind of like a slug, multiple cell, but not too many little bag organism. And you can like see the organs and it's like really, really tiny. And I was watching it eat this thing on this like video hologram. And it's like the most like disgusting, like wretched, like low creature on the earth, probably. And I was
Mm.
looking at it and I was like, I just don't feel like it's on the table for me to die and come back as one of these things. I was like, I really just don't. And I kind of like was like, do I really think that I could like come back as like a worm and all this stuff? Which, like I said, is not philosophical, but that was kind of when I started to be like, I'm talking about this a lot, but do I really think I'm going to come back as like a tiger? Like, I really don't feel that way. But in terms of like the, grace and like, do we get what we deserve and karma and all that stuff? Well, yeah, I mean, that was one big like domino falling for all of it for me too, was that, like I said, like aside from the art, I'm really like a worldview guy and kind of like obsessively playing out like the implications of worldviews and stuff like that.
Mm.
And yeah, I feel like the biblical or Christian worldview, whichever you want to say it, really the most accurately describes kind of our day-to-day situation, suffering, goodness, and things like that. And I feel like
Mm.
the picture it paints, I just couldn't stop coming back to it, even before I subscribed to it, as being like the most accurate. Again, like I only keep coming back to Buddhism because that was like my like systemic theology before I like became Christian.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you're playing with this game of like, well, yeah, it's all karma. So like your friend got hit by a car, but maybe it's because last lifetime around he, did something really shitty. I mean, if you really commit to it, that's kind of harsh, honestly. Like, do you really feel that way? And then also, suffering, life is like in Buddhism, like life is suffering basically. So you have to try and escape and like get to nirvana. And like that's a whole like 19-hour podcast unpacking that. But I
Yeah.
kind of got to this point where I was like, yeah, I really don't feel that way. Like on the one hand, I don't feel like suffering is caused by like this weird past life situation. And on the other hand, I don't really feel like life inherently is suffering. I feel like that's like a little too harsh. And yeah, I feel like the biblical worldview is the most subtle, but also like the most accurate, where it's like, yeah, well, the world is kind of blessed because it's infused with God's presence and like creation is inherently good. And like I do feel like that's true. Like, you go outside and you
Mm.
look at like a bush and it's like pretty awesome. But then also like
Yeah.
you're saying, like, bad things happen and we live in this fallen world where people don't exactly get what they deserve and sometimes that's benevolent, like it's grace, but then sometimes like Book of Ecclesiastes style, like yeah, some evil dude is going to get rich and like you live in a fallen world, like guess what, buddy, like that's how it is.
Yeah.
So yeah, I started to feel like it was almost like I slowly shifted over and then I was like, man, this like guy telling me about his worldview, that guy being like Christianity, I was like, that guy's making like a lot of sense. And I keep going outside and I just keep seeing what he's saying lining up one after the other. So yeah, I forgot how we jumped onto that, but yeah, definitely. I feel like
No,
the
good.
whole like
Good
how
points.
it fits in with everything was a big part of it.
Yeah, and you mentioned the problem of evil. Sin really, really, we hear it so much, but sin really, for me as well, really got to the meat of it. It really got to the meat of the bone, especially about like sin being like when you see evil, it's a lack of the good. It's like a privation. So like it's like a tooth is good, but then the cavity is like eating away at the goodness, but it's fundamentally something correct. So it's like, Lucifer was a fallen angel. So it's like original goodness, uh, sort of, how would you say, corrupted. And
Yeah.
what's great about that worldview, and this is something that I think, and somebody else might have had a different experience, but for me, the hope that comes with that wasn't present in Buddhism for me. And I don't want to make this sound like everything is it's not like I'm contrasting Christianity to Buddhism, but like you, it was largely my it was my worldview basically before fully going fully going towards Christianity, uh, you know, head first. But
Yeah, I think that tension is kind of like what is part of what gives the Christian worldview its power for sure. That tension between like,
mm,
well, we live in a fallen world, but God is good. There's actually this word, I think it's pronounced karmalipi. That's some Eastern theologians. I think I heard that they invented it for this purpose, but I don't speak Greek, so I can't tell. But it's the feeling of being happy that you live in a world infused with God's presence, but then also being like sorrowful that you're like distant from God for your whole life. So I think that tension of like, yeah, it's blessed, but we're also kind of cursed also. I think it's part of what gives the Christian worldview its power to explain like how we experience life and sin and all that stuff.
Yeah, Carmelipi, you say?
Yeah, it's
Carmelipi.
Charmolipi. That's a guess, but it definitely
Okay,
starts with
cool.
CH. You'll get close enough if you Google that.
Cool. I'll check it out. And yeah, it gives you also like the idea that eventually everything's going to be made right, is also immensely hopeful. Like it brings a sense of joy. Like there's this, like I didn't realize how restless I was until I really got what the Christian worldview was trying to say. Like there's this moment of, I mean, you still have anxiety, of course, and you still have worries, but you get to this point where it's like, if you really understand what this is trying to convey to you, the consequences is a much more, I don't know, I'd just say a deeper sense of being okay with the world. And you realize that really the approach to life is not necessarily optimism or pessimism, because what's that line? The optimist thinks that everything in the world is good except the pessimist. And the pessimist thinks that everything is bad except himself. And having an optimist or a pessimist view of the world is kind of like, I realize it's not really the right approach to have, because you're a part of this world before you get to decide if you want to be a part of this world. If we had come from some other world, then maybe we could go, well, and I'm kind of paraphrasing G.K. Chesterton here, but if you came from another world, you could go, well, the beautiful mountains kind of do make up for the angry dogs. And you could compare and be like, I guess that's a reason to be optimistic, but you're already enlisted in the army, or you're already fighting in the war before you even enlisted in the army. So the attitude towards the universe in Christianity is less optimism or pessimism and something more like patriotism. It's like I have an allegiance to the world, and if the world is broken, the point is that when something is good, you love it, but when something is wrong, you love it more because it needs more love, which is such a deep idea, and it completely changes the way you see everything. And that, like for me, when I realized that, yeah, like I belong to this world, and this is kind of aligning with a lot of what Alan Watts would often say. He would say things like, you didn't come from somewhere else, you come from this world. It's like, yeah, you didn't come from somewhere else. Like you have an allegiance to this world. And the right way to handle it is obviously with gratitude, but it's also a sort of a love for it. And when it's broken, a deeper love. Men didn't love Rome because she was great. She was great because they loved her. It's that sort of idea.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, well, yeah, I think there's a lot of like interesting, like really, really like fine lines and like trying to figure out like exactly like how to like parse it out and stuff. But for me, a lot of my journey with a lot of that has been at first when I was looking at the church, kind of like dealing with like heresies and stuff like that. At first you kind of have like the conception of like, wow, these guys are really angry about like everything, like chill. But I feel like, especially going back through it as someone who is like figuring out their worldview, it's kind of like what you're saying. It's kind of like playing out the implications of each of these little posits. Like, oh, here's this one heretic who said like X, Y, and Z, and then the church is like, well, the thing is though, if you think that, you're going to end up going down this road. And like the Gnostics are like a perfect example. Like, I feel
Yeah.
like trying to, what is it, like the road is it's like a thin road basically. But the point is like it's really easy to kind of veer off. Like you're like, oh, the world is fallen, but then 1 inch over to the left is like, oh, so we're Gnostic and like the material world is bad. And it's like, well, it's not really that exactly. Like, and we veer back on the road, and then it's like, oh, so yeah. Anyway, my point is that I feel like it's really easy to kind of like veer off the road, and again, that kind of hooks into like my obsession with like worldview and like implications of things and things like that. So yeah.
Do you see when you're doing your art, do you see, because I've often found when I'm doing something I recently took up painting. My fiance and I are sort of
Nice.
trying to figure it out now, but we're very bad. I'm not about to be posting my art, but when I do it, it's very meditative. So
Mhm.
it's almost like prayer. Do you find sometimes when you do art, there's a sort of meditative mindset or a prayerful mindset that comes along with it?
Well, it's a really interesting question. Yeah, I mean, the thing is that for me, my art making practice has always been 100% completely integrated with my spiritual life. So they're
Mm.
literally one thing 100%.
Wow,
Um,
that's
yeah,
awesome.
totally. And that's always been the case for me. Like even when I was the most into like occult stuff or anything like that, like the expression of that was me doing my art. And I think that's part of why I got into things like, chaos magic and, things like that, where it's like, oh, when you do anything, you're actually altering reality. And then when you alter reality, that's kind of like what doing magic is, right? And then for me, it was very intuitive to be like, well, yeah, I go to the store. I buy a bunch of like colored dirt, that being paint. And then I come to my house, I make a little image of like a meditating little Buddha, and then I give it to someone else. And it's like literally this like magical object that's broadcasting out this worldview. And then that can
Mm.
infect and affect them. And then they do something differently. So all of a sudden, 30 steps down the road, some like dog is getting adopted from an animal shelter or something because I took this colored dirt and made this image of like this little meditating Indian guy. So for me, it was
Yeah.
all very easy to integrate, especially with like shamanism and stuff like that. Like, you look at a shaman and he's like, yeah, I made this mask. I mean, I don't know if he would explain it this way, but like, I made this mask so that during a ritual, I can embody or become this deity and people will interact with this deity. And I'm painting in my room and I'm like, yeah, dude, tell me about it. Like it's a direct line to like what I'm doing, like in my mind. So they've always
Yeah.
been like totally married. So I think sometimes when people ask me that, I think like I asked a Buddhist painter that once, like, are you meditating like when you're painting? And I think people might imagine that like I sit down and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna do this drawing, and this drawing is like a prayer to Virgin Mary, which sometimes I do that, but it's more that like the expression of my spirituality is the art making practice, and they're not even two sides of the same coin. It's like one object, like in totality.
Wow. And I can imagine you're very, well, I don't know what the right word would be, sympathetic, or you're very inclined towards the more representational sides of Christianity, such as putting up icons, etc., just because of the sheer artistic element of it.
Yeah, well, it depends. I
Mm.
definitely think, well, in terms of like inclined, that could mean a few things. Like, I
Mm.
definitely
Yeah.
resonate with that
Mm.
immensely. I mean, I don't, in case anyone, a lot of people listening to this probably don't know me personally or like on the internet. I'm not part of like one particular Christian denomination. I'm kind of like figuring it out, I guess you could say. So just with
Yeah.
that caveat, the first time I went to an Orthodox church, an Eastern Orthodox church, I was like completely blown away. And I mean, I'm very like aesthetically minded, and just
Yeah.
seeing all the icons and all the gold, and I mean, it literally completely blew me away. I went there for this concert, and I
Hmm.
don't even think I didn't even listen to the music at all. Like no offense to them, but I was just sitting in this temple in this nave, whatever you call it, like the big main room of the church, and
Yeah.
like my eyes were just like feasting so hard
Just
on all the ornament. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't tell you one song that played, honestly. I was just going so hard on the visuals. So in terms of
yeah.
resonate with in that sense, I mean, yeah, 100%. In
Mm.
terms of my own art, it's interesting because I really am an illustrator. So it's kind of interesting. Someone asked me like on one of my YouTube painting things the other night, like, oh, you should do like a realistic painting of Virgin Mary and Jesus and stuff like that. So the thing is, I feel like I kind of, know my place in the whole chessboard of things happening. I kind of view myself as a tiny little like super specialized pawn on the whole big chessboard.
Yeah.
So in terms of like icons and stuff like that, like yeah, I really like it, but I definitely see that it's like not exactly my calling, if that makes sense. Like I made a graphic of Saint Herman of Alaska pretty recently,
Mm.
and when I made that, I really wanted it to land in the space of like, this is a cool picture of St. Herman, and not land in the space of like, this is an icon that is meant to embody the spiritual and physical nature of St. Herman. If you know what I'm saying, it's kind of like a pretty big
Yeah.
gap. We were talking about
Yeah.
one of the Virgin Mary drawings before. That's actually kind of a perfect example because when I'm doing that, I'm like, I'm kind of trying to bring the vibe. Honestly, as
Mm.
like weird as that sounds, but no one would ever look at that drawing and think, oh, this is what this person thinks Virgin Mary literally looked like, this little like oval faced, like kind of like simple drawing. So yeah, resonate in one sense for sure, but then on the other hand, like I really do focus on being like an illustrator and landing
Mm.
in a spot where I'm not what's the word I'm looking for? I kind of know my place. I'm not like an oil painter painting the face of Jesus. I'm like a guy doing cool drawings in like the church parking lot.
Yeah, I think that's really that's a huge part of the appeal, especially for me. I mean, there is a lot of um, well, there isn't a lot of the kind of things you're creating, at least not that I've managed to find. So the moment you find it, it's like, wow, give me more
Cool.
of this stuff because I just don't. And yeah, like for me, there is there is an element of the images that we see it create an impression for us of what we actually think. So like just I sent my little I sent my younger sister your image of Mary. She was like, wow, that's so cool. And she's kind of her response was kind of like, I didn't know there was Christian art like this, you know,
Nice.
kind of like people just aren't used to it in that sense. And
Cool.
that's in some ways that's sad, but it's also great that it's happening because you will inspire more people to do things like that. And I found some, here and there you'll see some digital Christian art, and you'll go like, "Wow, this is incredible." I remember seeing this one. I'll have to look for it and credit the person, but I don't know what the name was, but it's like the whole universe, and then like the Earth being shaped in like a spiral, and then right at the center is Christ on the cross, and then it goes back
Nice.
down, and it's just like this. There is this incredible art, but it's not people just at least again just from my experience, people just don't know about it. So keep doing what you're doing, man. I'm a big fan.
Word. Thanks, man.
Yeah,
Yeah, actually, so yeah, there's a few things there that I would definitely want to touch on. Like one of
yeah,
them is that yeah, so you mentioned it really quickly, but yeah, I think part of the reason why I like describing myself as an illustrator is that for me, the main interest, not the main interest, but one of the main interests is how what we think is related to the visual situation that we inhabit and put into our mind. I think that maybe, I don't know if other people underestimate it or maybe I've just thought about it a lot because I'm an artist, but yeah, for humans, like I think that we think that our main, it's gonna sound convoluted, but I think that we think our main thinking sense is verbal, but I think it's at least just as visual as it is verbal. Sometimes I think the visual is actually higher. In a lot of interesting ways, it's actually reflected in our language. Like if you're talking to someone, you might say like, "Oh, what he was saying wasn't very clear," which is like a visual metaphor, or like, "Oh, can you see what I'm saying?" which is like another visual metaphor. So we like
mm,
intuitively understand that like vision is like the main thing for us.
mm,
So yeah, as an illustrator, like marrying ideas and pictures together, I think is so powerful and what initially like drew me into the whole situation in general.
yeah,
It's also uniquely suited for like our time in a way because, if you think of like a masterpiece in terms of literature, you have to sit down and like read it. It's like 800, 900 pages. But if someone makes a visual masterpiece, like a really great painting, you can just
yeah,
walk by it. And the second that you look at it, you take it in. Whether you take it all in or not is debatable, but it's like
yeah,
instant almost in a way because your brain just like visually,
yeah,
um, takes all that in. So yeah, the ability of like visuals to convey ideas and rope into worldviews and things like that was really big for me.
mm,
And what was the other thing I was going to say? Oh yeah, asking about we didn't really explicitly say it, but I feel like we're kind of like towing around like the intersection of like art and like the sacred and things like that. And for me, I think a big part of it is that I kind of picked this up from Hermeticism, which is kind of it's kind of like a very vague folder. I would honestly say like Hermeticism is kind of like a meme. It's not really like one thing, but that's a whole other thing to go into.
yeah,
But some random guy was saying that we think of like the relationship between man and God as, like God made the world and then now humans are like sort of cut out collage style and like glued onto this painting. But this guy was saying, I'm not saying this is the Christian view, but maybe a tiny bit, but he was saying that God made the world, but then kind of left a little bit like undone, and then humans step into that space and have like room to like work a little bit.
mm,
And whether or not that's like, biblical or not, that kind of is how I think of things in a way. Like like, when I'm making art, it becomes like part of the universe, and it's a way of like participating in creation. And then if you infuse that with a theological worldview, like an architect
Mm.
making a really great church, I mean, that becomes part of God's creation. So in this
Yeah.
weird way that sounds maybe like a little blasphemous, but isn't really, because you could be humble about it. Like when humans create things, we're participating in the act of perpetually unfolding creation that we inhabit also. It's this weird loop where we're participating in the creation that we inhabit. And I think
Yeah.
playing with that feedback loop becomes like very powerful and almost becomes like an esoteric thing, like in and of itself.
Yeah. It's like the Imago Dei, like we're made in the image of God and God creates, and so we create. I mean, I don't
Totally.
think it's sorry, did you want to jump in?
No, yeah, totally. No, yeah, I agree.
It seems like there's a role we play in it, you know. Um, and our role is, I think, sometimes more important than we maybe give ourselves credit for. And I say that really in the most humble way possible, that I can say that. But I really want to jump back to what you said about this, the role that art plays in the sacred. Because one thing that I think that, especially in the classical world, that they really understood, and like anybody who knows me like personally knows that I don't have anything against modern architecture, but it just does not compare to classical architecture. And it seems like to me, one thing that the early church really understood was the role of beauty in the human's life, in our souls, the need for beauty, the need for the beautiful. And so, like when you think about, like, what comes to mind is maybe the Sistine Chapel, and
Hmm.
just considering, just it's like you look, and I'm speaking as if I've been there, right? Because I haven't, not yet. But like, just from everything that I've read and seen about it, you'll look up at one piece of art and you'll be like, "That's a masterpiece. It's incredible." And then you look left and there's another one, and then you look down and there's another
Yeah,
one,
yeah, yeah.
and everywhere you look, you're just you're just consumed by beauty. And it's like they understood the role that art plays. And it's kind of sad that the Catholics often get criticized for having images and things like that. Because I was actually raised Protestant, and we didn't have any images of, um, God or Jesus or Blessed Mother Mary. It was just a cross, and yeah, pretty much just that. And there are reasons for that. There's reasons Protestants, feel that you should not have any depictions. But I always just thought of it like, if somebody came into my house or okay, let me put it this way. If I have a picture of my fiance in my wallet and I miss her and I kiss the picture, I'm not, it's not that I'm worshiping the picture. I'm worshiping what it represents, right? I'm, uh, I'm attached to what it represents. So when you see these beautiful drawings and images of even your art, man, I know you really emphasize that you're an illustrator, but when I see some of your art, it does instill in me this sense of beauty, and it makes me consciously think of these supernatural realities, which are always present, but they are not always cognizant. Like you're not always actively thinking about them, and
Hmm.
your art does that for me. And I'm not trying to blow smoke, but I really feel, in terms of just like the role that art has on the sacred and transmitting that to people, it's so essential. And I think in some ways, I don't know if people are slowly moving back towards that, sort of. If I mean, even with architecture, I don't know if we're ever going to go back to the impractical but incredibly beautiful pieces of um, art. But anyway, um, yeah, man. I would like to just ask you two final questions. Actually, this is kind of the wrap up. Unless there
Cool.
was
Yeah,
anything
sure,
you
man.
wanted to touch on with sacred art, if you wanted to make a final point there, or anything else you wanted to say.
Um, no, I mean, I was thinking of a few things while you were talking. Well, just quickly, I guess, like,
Go
yeah,
for it.
yeah, I will say one or two things. Like, yeah, I think one thing about that is that's interesting for me is like, since I did just like, not just, but since I became Christian at a later point in my life, I think that I can kind of view like the different, if you want to call them denominations, and kind of see where people are coming from. But yeah, I think that because of where we're at in our time period, there is a point where I'm able to kind of look at it and be like, okay, maybe we went a little bit too far. Like I'm able to imagine, being like a German peasant and, everyone in your town's really poor and they're giving money to the Vatican. And then you go to the Vatican and see like, some crazy gold art. And maybe you're like, Martin Luther and you're like, "Dude, you guys really need all this money for this stuff." Like I can see where they're coming from, you could say. But then today,
Yes.
in my town, if I go to an evangelical church, some of them look like, a Holiday Inn. That's a hotel chain. They look like a hotel chain, like conference room or something. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah. I know what
so
you
I think
mean.
there's a point where I'm able to be like, okay, I think we went like a little too far here, guys. And
Yeah.
yeah, I guess the other thing that kind of really I feel like hits a lot is like it took me a while to kind of come around to this, but even in the Bible, like Jesus speaks in terms of images a lot, whether it's the parables, which are basically images, or like even visual metaphors like the Lamb of God and things like that. So I think there is
Yeah.
something, it's a whole nother like 9 hour podcast, but I feel like there is something about the Christian experience that's married to symbolism in a way that
Yes.
is unique that I feel like a lot of us maybe, I think it's maybe because of the tinge of like, we don't want to be like, occultist, esoterica, black magician weirdos, but like I think we've kind of maybe stepped away from that too far. Like even, I'm not saying it's a symbol as in it's not real, but even something like
Hmm.
Jesus designating the Eucharist, like the bread becomes his body. You know what I mean? He didn't have to make it bread, but obviously bread was chosen for like a reason. You know what I mean? So I think there is something
Yeah.
about the world being infused with like the mind of God and things like that, and it becoming like
Hmm.
symbolic in a way that maybe
Yeah.
because of Jungianism or something, I think we've kind of stepped away maybe a little bit too far. But yeah, that's something
Mm.
I think about a lot, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, that's those are so many great points. The last two things I wanted to ask you is just one, where can people find you? Where can people follow you? Where can people view your art? And then I'd also like you, if you don't mind, just to tell us which piece of art that you've created are you particularly fond of? In other words, what is your maybe one of your
Good
favorite
question.
pieces? And you
Um,
could just give us those two. I'd love to
Yeah,
know.
yeah, for sure, for sure. Okay, yeah, first off, the more clerical things. Yeah, where can you find my stuff? So I'm mostly my main kind of broadcasting thing is Twitter. It's at Owen Broadcast. I'm Owen Cyclops on Twitter. That's like my main kind of feed, I guess you could say. I'm also on Instagram with the same at, it's Owen Broadcast. I have a website, it's owencyclops.com. And also on YouTube, I do a painting show every Tuesday night called Ophanim. Owen Painting Hour, America, New Image Making Painting Hour, where I just hang out and paint. And I'm pretty much always doing like visions and symbols from the Bible and stuff like that. And it's a pretty cool time, I think, because I host it. Obviously, I think it's cool. So yeah, basically Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. Um, that's basically it. Oh yeah, and also I guess I'll plug. I sell like prints and art, and I'm kind of doing more fine art, framed art, and stuff like that. So if you go to Twitter, you'll see it there.
Awesome.
Oh yeah. Anyway, uh, something that I made that is kind of like you didn't say my favorite, but that's kind of like what you were getting at. Something that I'm like really vibing on really hard.
Yeah.
Honestly, it was sometime last year. That doesn't mean that the stuff I've made in the last year hasn't been awesome, but the first thing that came to mind when you said that was I did this image of the Temptation of Saint Anthony, and I think that one sticks out for me just because of where I was at when I made it. I'll email you a picture of it. So basically, the deal
Sure.
is like I'm sure some people have probably seen it, or maybe we'll put it up in the video.
Yeah,
But
I'll put it up in the video.
yes, there's a painting. It's really famous. It's supposedly by Michelangelo of the Temptation of Saint Anthony, where he's hanging in the air, and there's all these demons around him, and they're pulling on him, and there's all these different like weird, multi-faced animal demons and stuff like that. And it was kind of at this time in my life, which was not that long ago, like last year, even now, I still wrestle with this. But like, I felt like I was in this kind of middle ground where I had like shed these vices and stuff like that, and kind of come to terms with like the truth and how I want to live and all this stuff, and my family and friends and like literally everything. And I felt
Yeah.
like I just had all this stuff like weighing on me, like just randomly. Like I'd be going to get like a cup of coffee and I'd see someone smoking a cigarette and I'd be like, oh my God, smoking weed. I used to smoke weed. That would be so tight. All my friends, when I hang out with them, they're going to be smoking weed and I can't smoke with them. And I have this like anguish, like, and it was like every time I turned a corner, it was like getting hit with like this brick wall of like, and I saw that painting and I was like, wow, this is literally exactly what it feels like. I'm in the
Yeah.
shower and I'm imagining some argument I had with my aunt like 6 months ago about like, some random thing, like, and I'm getting really angry and it's not even happening. So that's really how I felt, like that all these demons were like around me. So
Yeah.
over like maybe like 6 months or so, it
Wow.
wasn't that long, but I work on it on and off. I illustrated that picture and each one of the demons is one of the, I turned it into one of those things that I had been like wrestling with. And it was really like, honestly, like a really, really powerful experience. I did the first one that I did. I won't go through every demon, but the first one was kind of like the most for me because I used to like drink a lot. And it's kind of a long story, but I had this thing where I actually ended up getting jaundice, but it wasn't from the drinking, but I thought it was from the drinking. So I felt really bad about it because I thought I had like permanently injured myself. And like,
Oh
it was,
man.
and it was kind of like a symbol of like me kind of not caring about life. So anyway, I illustrated the first demon and I made it like alcohol, and I was painting it in. I gave it these scales, and then I went in and I gave it these like yellow eyes. And I just had this moment where I was like, wow, we just crossed over to like too real. And I was like just looking at this demon on my screen with these like teeth and like these eyes, and he's wielding like a beer bottle and he's about to like hit me with it. And yeah, when I was drawing it, I was like, damn, like it's just that feeling. If anyone makes art or music or writing, like sometimes you have that feeling of like, damn, we just got like too real. And like that's really how I felt. And then I went all the way around and did, like drugs and anger and depression and all this stuff. And yeah, it was kind of
Yeah.
right at this time where like I was really wrestling with all that stuff the hardest, I guess you could say. I mean, I still do it every day, but yeah, that would be one for sure. I feel like when I made that, it was the feeling like when I finished it and put it online, it was like I took a pen and it was like, okay, that chapter of my life is closed, and now I'm on the next chapter of dealing with all this stuff. And it was a very tangible, like, all right, like now we're on the next chapter, and it felt really good. So that's definitely what first came to mind when you asked me that.
Awesome, man. Well,
Yeah.
I'm sure everybody's gonna go and check out your stuff, and I really want to recommend everybody go and check out his art. It's incredible, um, and it's different, but in the best possible way. You'll be sorted out for profile pictures and wallpapers for like the next however long. They're so cool.
Cool. Thanks, man.
And
Yeah, I'm still at the
oh
stage where I'm just, and people are responding to it. So I'm really glad you feel that way.
yeah, no, I'm a big fan. Like, and I wanted to say thank you so much for your time and for you're actually the first official guest on my channel. So this will be episode number 1 of whatever I decide to title this new series I'm going to be starting. But I
Nice.
really appreciate the time and I really enjoyed the conversation, man.
Yeah,
It was
man,
nice.
definitely. I hope I set the tone for your guest, the inaugural guest. I hope I said it well. And yeah, man, it was really fun hanging out with you, dude. Maybe we'll do this again sometime.
Yeah, likewise. Look forward to it. Thanks
Cool.
again, Owen.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, man.
Pleasure.
See you later.
See you later. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. And I'll see you in the next video. And have a lovely day. Bye.